In this video, we're going to look at a certain type of function called a piecewise function. So a piecewise function is really exactly what it sounds like. It's different parts of a function put together. So what's going to happen is if you have a graph that's maybe like part of a parabola and part of a line, and you want to write it all together, you could write it as a piecewise function. So there's multiple different functions, or maybe 3 different types of lines put together to create this graph. And you would have to write the equation using piecewise notation. So the first thing we're going to look at is what a piecewise equation looks like, and then we'll actually look at the graphs of them. So in this example, you see this bracket here, and there's 2 different parts. So these are the 2 different pieces. So there's this part number 1, and there's this part number 2. And each piece contains a restriction or a condition that you have to follow. So what this means is if x is less than 0, we're going to use this first part. That's what the rule is we have to follow. If x is greater than or equal to 0, well then that means I have to plug into x minus 1. That's the rule, or that's the part of the function I want to use. So these right here are the conditions, and they tell us which piece to use. So you don't actually plug into those, you just read those, and those tell you what to plug into. So are we going to plug into this yellow part, or are we going to plug into this blue part right here? So that's what we're going to be plugging into. So we look at this first example. We look at what's our input. So in this case, our input is -4. So we ask ourselves, well, which category does -4 belong to? Does it belong to it's less than 0, or is it greater than or equal to 0? Well, -4 is less than 0, so that means I need to use number 1. I'm going to use equation number 1. So when I go to plug in, I'm going to have f of -4 equals, and I'm plugging right into this, into the yellow. So I'm choosing number 1 because -4 was less than 0. So I'm going to put my parentheses plus 1. My input is -4, so I go ahead and input that in. We end up with -4 squared is going to be 16. Remember to put that in parentheses if you're putting that in your calculator, because it's a negative times a negative. Plus 1 gives me 17. So there's the first one. Second one, the input is 0. So since the input is 0, that means we are going to plug into the second equation, because that's when x is greater than or equal to 0. In this case, it equals 0, so we're going to use number 2. So that's the one we plug into. So when we plug in, we have f of 0. So we have parentheses minus 1, input the 0. 0 minus 1 is -1. And we keep going here. So we look at the next one. The input is 4. So since we have 4 as our input, which category does that satisfy? 4 is greater than 0. So it's going to go in number 2. So we're going to use number 2. So we plug in. So number 2, so f of 4. And then we go ahead and write our template. So parentheses minus 1 is equation 2. My input is 4, so go ahead and input 4. 4 minus 1 is 3. So that's it. If you look at the next one, we have 3 parts now. So it's going to be the exact same thing. Here are our conditions right here. So we have x is less than 0. 0 and 2 are what x is bounded by. So x has to be greater than or equal to 0, or x is less than or equal to 2. And this last one, x is greater than 2. So those are our 3 conditions. Here's our formulas. So x plus 1 is one of them, 1, and -x plus 3. So those are our 3 parts. So part 1, part 2, and part 3. So 3 different types of equations to make up this piecewise. So we go ahead, we look at 4. 4 belongs to the third category. It's greater than 2. So that means we're going to use number 3. So when we go to plug in, so g of 4, negative, parentheses where the x is, plus 3. So our 4 gets inputted into the parentheses. So this ends up being negative 4 plus 3. So we get negative 1. Look at the next one here, 1.5. So 1.5 is between 0 and 2. So that means it's in category 2. So we're going to use equation number 2, or part number 2. And we go ahead and we set it up. And we copy this down, and wherever there's an x, we put parentheses, but there's no x, so there's no parentheses. So really what that means is there's nothing for us to plug into, so it's just going to equal 1. That's it. There's no x for me to plug 1.5 in. The third one here, negative 6 is less than 0, so when x is less than 0, that's true for negative 6. So for this one, we're going to use number 1. So g of negative 6 equals, we write our template. So our template is parentheses plus 1. Insert our input into that, parentheses. So negative 6 plus 1 gives me negative 5. So if this is making sense to you, the graphing is basically the same idea. So let's do this last one here, and then we're going to look at some graphs. So 0, well, that's going to be this category number 2 because you have an equals 0. So this is when x is greater than or equal to 0 and less than or equal to 2. So for this one, you're going to use number 2, or part 2. So g of 0 is equal to, it's just going to be 1. There's nothing for us to plug into.